You got some guts for a rich kid.
Some films don't just push boundaries, they obliterate them, and then they get punished for it. We're talking about science fiction masterpieces so raw, so uncompromising, so aggressively ahead of their time that studios panicked, censors lost their minds, and entire countries said no. Not because these films were bad, because they were too good at making people uncomfortable. And here's the thing, these aren't your typical cult classics that found their audience on home video. These are films that were actively suppressed, censored, re-edited against the filmmaker's wishes, or flat out rejected by the very industry that created them. And the wildest part? Nearly every single one of them is now considered a landmark of the genre. So today we're counting down 10 sci-fi masterpieces that the world simply was not ready for. And you're about to find out exactly why they were too hardcore to exist. Number 10. Death Race 2000, 1975.
Come on, here they come! Not finished! Come on!
In 1975, Roger Corman heard that a major Hollywood studio was spending $5 million on a dystopian sports movie called Rollerball. His response was pure Corman. He grabbed a budget of roughly $300,000, optioned the rights to a 1956 short story called The Racer by Ib Melchior, and told director Paul Bartel to make the whole thing fast enough to beat Rollerball into theaters. And he did. Death Race 2000 hit screens in April 1975, a full 2 months before the film it was designed to exploit even opened. And here's the thing, Peter Fonda was Corman's first choice for the lead role of Frankenstein, the masked, leather-clad champion of the race. Fonda read the script and told Corman it was too ridiculous to make. So Corman turned to David Carradine, who had just wrapped the final season of Kung Fu and was desperate to prove he could exist beyond the shadow of Cain. Carradine signed on for a deal that paid him 10% of the film's gross. The supporting cast included a young, unknown Sylvester Stallone as the volatile machine gun Joe Viterbo. Behind the scenes, Bartel and Corman were at war throughout filming. Bartel wanted satire. Corman, on the other hand, wanted splatter. Bartel later admitted that most of his guilty pleasures in the film were ripped out by the roots by Corman and replaced with crushed heads and blood squibs. The result was a film too extreme for mainstream critics, but too clever for pure exploitation. And it worked. Death Race 2000 earned over $5 million in its initial run. It outperformed Rollerball in several markets. It was cheaper, nastier, and in the eyes of many critics, smarter. Number 9. Hardware, 1990.
How's it going?
Fine.
Before Richard Stanley ever stepped behind a camera for his first feature film, he was dodging bullets in Afghanistan. The South African-born filmmaker had spent time embedded with a guerrilla Muslim faction during the Soviet-Afghan War, shooting a documentary in one of the most dangerous conflict zones on the planet. He walked out of that war zone and almost immediately began pre-production on hardware. The budget was around $1.5 million, roughly 960,000 British pounds, financed through Palace Pictures and British Screen. Behind the scenes, the opening desert sequences were shot in Morocco, while the rest of the film was built inside London's abandoned Roundhouse venue, a location so poorly soundproofed that every single line of dialogue in the finished film had to be completely re-recorded in post-production. Miramax, who handled the American release, insisted on casting American leads, which is how Dylan McDermott ended up starring as Moses Baxter. The violence that Stanley put on screen was so graphic that the MPAA gave Hardware their X rating not once, not twice, but 3 times before Stanley trimmed enough to scrape by with an R. McDermott himself reportedly objected to certain scenes during filming, and Miramax actually prevented Stanley from shooting 2 of the death sequences he had planned. Even after those compromises, Hardware was still one of the most aggressively brutal genre films of its year. Then came the lawsuit. Fleetway Comics, the British publisher of the legendary 2000 AD magazine, noticed that Hardware bore a suspicious resemblance to a 7-page strip called Shock that had appeared in a 1980 issue. Stanley maintained he was more influenced by films like Soylent Green, but the similarities were too striking. Despite all of that chaos, Hardware debuted at number 6 in the United States, earned over $2.3 million in its opening weekend, and finished with a total gross north of $5.7 million. Number 8. Tetsuo the Iron Man, 1989. Shinya Tsukamoto had been making films since the age of 14 when his father gave him a Super 8 camera. By his 20s, he had formed a theater group called Kaiju Theater with collaborators Kei Fujiwara and Tomorowo Taguchi, both of whom would star in Tetsuo. The budget was around $130,000. Tsukamoto wrote it, directed it, produced it, edited it, shot much of it alongside Fujiwara, and starred in it as the metal fetishist. The cast totaled 6 people. And here's the thing. Behind the scenes, the production was a war of attrition. Most of the crew lived on set inside Fujiwara's apartment. Taguchi, the lead actor, was the only person who did not sleep there, and he later recalled that nearly every day he arrived for filming, another crew member had vanished. One day he showed up, and the entire lighting department was gone. He had to light his own scenes. By the end, it was just the actors left. The conditions were so miserable and Tsukamoto so relentlessly demanding that the shoot disintegrated around him. When it was finally over, Tsukamoto admitted that he contemplated destroying the footage entirely. Instead, he booked the Nakano Musashino Hall, a tiny venue in Tokyo that seated just 80 people, and screened Tetsuo for late-night audiences. It was, in his own words, the smallest theater in Tokyo. Then, film critic Yoichi Komatsuzawa suggested submitting it to the Fanta Festival in Rome. Tsukamoto could not even afford subtitles. The film screened in Rome entirely in Japanese, with no translation whatsoever. The sheer visceral force of the imagery, the industrial soundtrack by Chu Ishikawa, the stop-motion sequences of flesh merging with scrap metal, none of it needed words. When Tetsuo returned to Tokyo, it ran for 3 consecutive months and became a top seller on home video for non-mainstream cinema in Japan. And here's the thing, what Tsukamoto had done was not just make a film. He had reignited an entire national film industry during one of its most creatively barren decades. Japanese studios were going bankrupt in the late 1980s, audiences were abandoning domestic cinema for foreign imports, and independent filmmaking had almost no international profile. Tetsuo changed all of that overnight. Number 7. Altered States, 1980.
No knuckle walking, shorter arms, he's moving along so gracefully.
Before it became a cult landmark with an 84% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, Altered States was nearly destroyed by the 2 men who made it. In fact, that tension is baked into every frame. And the story of how this film survived its own creation is just as hallucinatory as anything on screen. Pre-production alone was a disaster. Director Arthur Penn walked off the project in late 1978. Special effects wizard John Dykstra followed shortly after. The film got transferred from Columbia to Warner Brothers as the proposed budget climbed to $15 million. By the time filming actually began, the movie had already chewed through 2 major collaborators before a single camera rolled. And here's the thing, the film's director, Ken Russell, had never made a film in Hollywood before. This was his first, and he arrived ready to fight. During 3 weeks of rehearsals, Russell and writer Paddy Chayefsky had a massive dispute. Chayefsky left the project and did not appear on set during filming. Russell, according to producer Howard Gottfried, was polite and deferential before production, then began treating Chayefsky as a non-entity, becoming mean and sarcastic. At a time, Chayefsky reportedly tried to have Russell removed as director. He failed. He did succeed at one thing. He took his name off the credits entirely, substituting Sidney Aaron, his actual first and middle names. And yet what Russell built with that stolen script was extraordinary. Behind the scenes, Russell replaced special effects expert John Dykstra with Bran Farren, who created the visual effects actually used in the film. Dick Smith handled the groundbreaking special makeup effects, making extensive use of his pioneering air bladder technique. Altered States opened and grossed nearly $20 million. Number 6. Videodrome, 1983.
You know, in Brazil, Central America, those kinds of places, making underground video is considered a subversive.
David Cronenberg was so worried that the script for Videodrome would be rejected by his own financiers that he almost did not pitch it. The content was that extreme. When he finally presented the idea to producer Claude Heroux, Heroux read it and joked that the film would receive a XXX rating. He greenlit it anyway. What followed was one of the most prophetic, disturbing, and commercially catastrophic science fiction films of the 1980s. The budget was 5.9 million Canadian dollars. Shooting began on October 19, 1981, with a problem that would define the entire production. Behind the scenes, Cronenberg started filming with a toned-down and incomplete second draft, and continued writing and rewriting new scenes every single day of the shoot. Fresh pages were distributed to cast and crew regularly. He did not stop rewriting until December 19th, the very last day of principal photography. Additional makeup effects photography was done months later in March 1982, and the crew was called back to Toronto in May to reshoot the climax entirely. The legendary Rick Baker created the film's nightmarish practical effects with a team of young technicians, many of them barely 20 years old. Baker's most iconic creation was the abdominal slit that opens in Woods' stomach, a pulsating organic cavity into which videotapes and eventually a handgun are inserted. The prop required Betamax cassettes rather than VHS because VHS tapes were physically too small to fit inside the prosthetic stomach. Woods later described the experience of wearing the rig as fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. 3 different endings were filmed. The one that made the final cut, in which Max shoots himself while whispering the words, "Long live the new flesh," was actually conceived by Woods himself. Cronenberg had planned an even more disturbing epilogue that would have revealed additional characters with their own chest cavities, but the budget could not accommodate it. The effects were too complex. When Videodrome opened on February 4, 1983, it made just $2.1 million. Universal had delayed it from its original December 1982 slot to avoid competing with the holiday season, and the gamble backfired. Number 5. Event Horizon, 1997.
Introductions all around. This is my XO, Lieutenant Stark.
The reason this film exists in the form you can watch today is because of James Cameron. Not because Cameron had anything to do with making it, but because his delay of Titanic blew a hole in Paramount's summer 1997 release calendar so large that the studio scrambled to fill it with anything they could get their hands on. And here's the thing. Event Horizon contained footage so disturbing that a test audience member reportedly fainted. Paramount executives were physically aghast, and the film was butchered by over 30 minutes before it ever reached a single paying customer. Behind the scenes, Paul W.S. Anderson had been given significant creative freedom during principal photography. The production sprawled across 7 sound stages. The sets were so elaborate that the wooden construction created constant noise problems, forcing the entire cast to re-record all of their dialogue in post-production. During one particularly intense sequence involving a fireball effect, a soundstage actually caught fire. But the real disaster came after filming Wrapped. Anderson's original cut ran 130 minutes. The first time Paramount saw it was at the first test screening, because the truncated post-production schedule meant the studio had never even watched dailies of the most extreme footage. What they saw horrified them. Anderson later recalled that the original version featured extended sequences of the Event Horizon's original crew destroying themselves in what he bluntly described as a blood orgy. The post-production window was cut again to just 4 weeks. Anderson was given 7 days between the first disastrous test screening and the second to make radical changes. He has said publicly that 7 days was not enough time to make rational, well-thought-out decisions about a film of this scale. When Event Horizon opened, it grossed just $26.7 million domestically. Number 4. Starship Troopers, 1997. Paul Verhoeven read maybe a third of Robert Heinlein's novel before he told his writer to stop making him finish it. He found the source material boring and militaristic, so he set out to make a film that looked like propaganda for the very ideology it was mocking, and almost nobody at the time understood what he had actually built. The production budget was around $110 million. And here's the thing, Starship Troopers was supposed to save Verhoeven's career. His previous film, 1995's Showgirls, had been one of the most spectacular critical and commercial disasters in Hollywood history. But trouble started before the film even reached audiences. Sony, nervous about the enormous financial risk, brokered a deal with Disney's Buena Vista International division to split all costs and revenue. The film was originally slated for a prime summer release on July 2, 1997. Sony pulled it from that date and dropped in the far more commercially friendly Men in Black instead, pushing Starship Troopers to a November opening. By the time critics saw it, the reaction was brutal. Starship Troopers grossed $121 million worldwide, a number that looked acceptable on paper but turned into a loss once marketing costs were factored in. Number 3. RoboCop, 1987. Before it became one of the defining action films of the 1980s, RoboCop was rejected outright by the ratings board. Not once, not twice. According to director Paul Verhoeven, the film had to be edited and resubmitted to the MPAA 8 separate times before it earned an R rating instead of an X. For a movie about a cyborg cop, that is an extraordinary amount of violence to strip out. The irony is sharper than it looks. Most films earning an X rating in that era were flagged for sexual content. RoboCop earned it purely on graphic violence, standing in stark contrast to nearly every other X-rated release of its time. The budget was $13.7 million. Behind the scenes, Rob Bottin and his special effects team had been fighting with director Paul Verhoeven for months over the design of the iconic suit, clashing over everything from the overall silhouette to how the helmet removal scene should be lit. By the time the suit was finally ready, It took 11 hours to fit Peter Weller inside it. And when Weller stood up in the suit, he realized that all the months of mime training he had done to prepare for the robotic movements were completely useless. He could barely walk. In fact, production had to be shut down so that Weller and his movement coach, Moni Yakin, could start from scratch and learn how to perform as a machine inside a costume that weighed him down like actual armor. Weller reportedly lost around 3 pounds a day filming. He could not fit into the police car while wearing the full costume, so every driving scene was filmed with Weller wearing only the top half of the suit and sitting in his underwear. The most contentious scene was the ED-209 boardroom massacre, where a malfunctioning prototype security robot shreds a corporate executive with automatic gunfire while colleagues watch in horror. In the uncut version, the shooting goes on so long it becomes absurd, which was exactly Verhoeven's intention. RoboCop opened and earned $53.4 million worldwide. Number 2. Crash, 1996. When Ted Turner sat down to watch this film on his ranch with Jane Fonda, he reportedly nearly choked. In fact, Turner was so appalled by what he saw that he personally intervened to block the film's scheduled October 1996 release in the United States. Crash is based on J.G. Ballard's controversial 1973 novel of the same name, a clinical and deliberately disturbing exploration of a group of people who become sexually aroused by automobile collisions. Cronenberg adapted it faithfully, starring James Spader as a television producer who survives a head-on car crash and descends into a subculture led by a man named Vaughn, played by Elias Koteas. The budget was between $8 and $10 million. Behind the scenes, it was chaos upon chaos upon chaos. At Cannes, the screening provoked boos and walkouts. It was so bad that Francis Ford Coppola, who was serving as jury president, was reportedly so opposed to a decision that he refused to personally hand Cronenberg the award. Cronenberg later claimed that Coppola had blocked the film from winning the Palme d'Or entirely. What happened next was unprecedented. The Daily Mail and Evening Standard in the United Kingdom launched a sustained campaign to ban Crash from British cinemas, publishing over 400 reports attacking the film as depraved. Westminster Council banned the film from screening in any cinema in London's West End, even though the British Board of Film Classification had already passed it uncut with an 18 certificate. Psychologists were brought in to determine whether the film would inspire copycat behavior. Their findings dismissed those concerns, but the damage to public perception was already done. The film grossed $23.2 million worldwide against its modest budget, meaning that commercially, Crash actually turned a profit, but the cultural scar ran deeper than any box office number. Number 1. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. This is the film whose own director banned it, not a studio, not a government, not a ratings board. Stanley Kubrick himself, one of the most powerful filmmakers who ever lived, personally requested that Warner Brothers pull A Clockwork Orange from distribution in the United Kingdom in 1973. The film would not be legally screened in Britain again for 27 years, not until Kubrick was dead. Based on Anthony Burgess's 1962 novel, A Clockwork Orange follows Alex DeLarge, a charismatic teenage delinquent in a dystopian near-future Britain who leads his gang of droogs on nightly rampages of what he cheerfully calls ultra-violence. Kubrick wrote, directed, and produced the film on a budget of just $1.3 million. The film was shot almost entirely on existing London locations, with sets built only for the Korova Milk Bar and a handful of interiors. And here's the thing. Behind the scenes, Kubrick struggled to find a backer at all, pitching studio after studio with little interest, even approaching Francis Ford Coppola's fledgling American Zoetrope without success before securing funding through Seven Arts Productions in partnership with Warner Brothers. What Malcolm McDowell endured to bring Alex DeLarge to life reads like its own horror story. During the infamous Ludovico technique sequence, McDowell was strapped into an actual chair with real eye clamps holding his eyelids open, a genuine ophthalmologist from Moorfields Eye Hospital standing by to keep his corneas moist. The anesthesia wore off mid-scene. The lid locks slipped and scratched his corneas, temporarily blinding him. He endured the agony, took 5 days to recover, and then Kubrick insisted on doing it all over again for one more close-up. McDowell also cracked several ribs during an on-screen brawl sequence. He later said Kubrick negotiated away his promised share of the film's profits entirely. When A Clockwork Orange opened, the controversy following release was just as brutal. The film was blamed for a string of copycat crimes, most of which were later found to have no real connection to the film at all, yet the moral panic was enough to provoke public threats against Kubrick and his family. After police advice, Kubrick demanded Warner Brothers pull the film from its UK release in 1973. A Clockwork Orange grossed roughly $114 million worldwide. And that is the list. 10 films that bled for their art. If you have not seen every film on this list, now you know where to start. And if you have, drop your favorite in the comments and tell us which one hit you the hardest. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive like this one. Until next time.